Thanks for joining us. My name is Ajay Reddy, and this is Nick Jurinich. We are from Scrum-Do. And the last 2 years, we've been involved in an Agile transformation with a company up here in the Northeast. It's a very large insurance company. It's been around for 150 years. We've had to change the name of the insurance company for legal purposes. But this is a real-life case study, and a lot of the names have been changed to protect the guilty. By their own admission, this company has saved $300 million by their own admission. And so this is a story about their journey the last couple of years, and it is a story about strategy. It's a story about how Agile transformation is taking place. If you've been in the Kanban community for any little while longer, you've probably heard the name Mike Burrows, and you've heard Dimitar Bakazhev, Nick Zurinik, Michael Delamaza. A lot of these folks have been involved in this gig. So what you'll realize in this story, and what the big part of the story is, that it is actually what we did not know that turned out to be a lot more relevant than what we did know in terms of the Agile transformation. And it's quite humbling, actually, standing here to tell you it is not our efforts, it's much more of our probes and our discoveries that actually led to some of the successes. So a little bit of the background of this company. It's a 150-year-old company, as I mentioned. It is here based in the Northeast, and many of the policies in this company were implemented. Some of the policies in this company were implemented pre-Second World War. So it's so the business rules, all that stuff is pretty archaic. They survived. It's a testament to their success. And what you'll realize, what they realize is what was working for them for the last century is not working for them anymore. And especially in the last 20 years or so, they've been finding it particularly hard in coping with the challenges coming from startups. The company had 120 teams scattered across 5 different locations in the UK and in the US. And what they basically employed, I'm sorry, I'm looking at my notes here. What they basically employed is what we call traditional strategy in our deck. And I really like these two things here, 2 quotes, and they're very complementary to each other. One is David's quote, and David did not pay me any money to put his quote up here. And the other one is, is this Nilofer's article. And what they basically make a point about is that we live in a very non-deterministic environment when it comes to the market. And whether it's variability coming from knowledge work itself or the changes in the market, both make it for a very difficult thing for traditional strategy to live on. And so what traditional strategy typically looks like is, this is a great, this is Vijay Bhatia's picture, and it's quite simply the vision, mission, sort of Henry Ford saying, we'll democratize the automobile, right? And then from which you have sort of analysis done, internal and external analysis done, right? And then options developed, and then a decision-making framework applied, strategies identified, and then implementation begun, right? Sort of classic traditional strategy. And Mammoth Insurance was no different, right? In fact, the options that they developed was pretty much based almost identical, based on this process. And the tools of the analysis phase, in their case, should be familiar to many of the consultants in the room, right? So they were no different. And there's nothing wrong in and of themselves, right? It is how they applied and the environment in which they applied. The options that were developed were pretty much, most of them you must be familiar with. And one of the common thread amongst all of these tools is it's entirely based on what they did know and what they could control. And Mammoth Insurance was no different. They applied the same tools.
So before you go on, it's probably the example to talk about there is it was a long, drawn-out process.
Oh yeah. So the one thing that one example, one concrete example was they basically started on a 9-month analysis phase, out of which came basically a big, large strategy document. One particular strategy document was a test strategy document, right? And some of the Agile coaches had actually reviewed, and if you looked at the strategy document, you would see terms like iterations, sprints, user stories, epics. I mean, everything that you probably are familiar with. But if you take a step back, the output was a test strategy document, and that was pretty much applied across the board. So remember I gave you that sort of flow chart earlier? The options that they developed and the decisions that came out, the choices that they made, basically, it looks like it's on a timer. Can that be controlled? They basically said they're going to develop new offerings, right? New product offerings. And how did they do that? And I'll explain that, the detailed process in a second here. But it was experts sitting in a room, doing some analysis and coming up with new product lines, right? And they said, oh, our current processes are insufficient and need to be improved, and so we're going to do an Agile transformation, right? And to do this, to develop these new product offerings and to implement new processes, we need vendors. How do they choose vendors? The same analysis, right? So they bring a whole different kinds of vendors. They do a thorough analysis of these vendors, rate them on different point scale schemes, have different nice Excel spreadsheets, and come up with vendor choices. And then they choose one of the vendors.
I think that's pertinent to apply to the actual transformation. There's a couple of things going on about a product development, but actually the transformation was like the planned one. We want to get to, going back to David's keynote even, like the planned destination. And that's how, that mindset permeated across everything.
So one of the key clues for as we were getting involved is that the vendor who was chosen to help them digitally transform was an expert in the insurance domain, but not specific to this particular insurance domain. Right? So there was a clue for us in that regard. So what were some inadequacies of this approach?
Well, we just alluded to an example of that is outputs over outcomes. So we had this 150-page, for example, 150-page test document, which, as we know, ends up being shelfware gathering dust. No one really quite understood it and didn't actually fit the context. It was a perfect world scenario. This is how we shall develop and test. There was, a reductionist, everything Akoff tells us not to do, but we want to break everything down into component parts, and that includes these outputs, but also how we design our teams. For instance, thou shall have the 7 plus or minus 2 Scrum teams. And then hope they will all come together and maybe that does happen.
Yeah, just to build on that, and that didn't apply just to teams, right? Everything from teams to time boxes to scope was smaller and smaller things. And somehow the expectation was that they would all line up and build this amazing thing. Right? And so one of the things we saw was the real risks that the company was facing, some of it known and some of it yet to be discovered, the options that they chose to pick, what they actually committed to do, what they were actually doing, and what actually got done, there were gaps amongst all of these things. So what actually got done was so far away from the risks that they were supposedly supposed to reduce, were just completely misaligned, right? And this idea that Nick referred to, where they were sort of breaking up teams, and this is, I mean, you've seen a ton of Agile presentations where they were just sort of reorging, right? Reorging for the sake of reorging to fit a particular model, right? And it's just an example of...
Which is our tampering.
Yeah,
idea.
it's an example of tampering, right? So you don't really know what the problem you're trying to solve is. And so, and especially in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty, both from a market standpoint and in the internal organization standpoint, it was just creating havoc and a lot of consternation amongst the teams. Another pattern we were seeing was trying to explain, and what Dave Snowden might call retrospective coherence, was trying to see, looking back and explaining things that perfectly fit the narrative that they were trying to pass on, right? And in the design of the products that I mentioned, where experts sat in a room, what was happening was the experts from claims and underwriting and, take your pick, the department that was responsible for anything that to do with the product, they would sit together in a room and hash out the various parts of the features of the product line with very little validation. And some of it, I mean, I'm speaking the language of lean startup now, right? So there's no the product validation from a market standpoint, right? But even in terms of getting these experts in a room, there was sort of premature convergence on what it is that they're going to build, which may or may not have reduced the actual risks that they were dealing with.
And basically ignoring any unknowns.
Right.
We probably should move on a bit.
Yeah, and so in terms of the urgency of what it was, the aspect of the cost of delay was rarely ever considered, right? And completely ignoring the fact of the system stability itself, right? And a part of this, another such plan, this is an actual sort of blurred out vision image of the actual plan. This is the Enterprise Agile Transition Plan. How many of you have seen something like this? Right? Yeah, I'm sure. So this has a timeline, right? And they're going to be stable the first thing, time period. The next time period, there's going to be another. This is stable, predictable, and learning and adapting, right? It's wonderfully fit a plan. And this was, again, an output of traditional strategy applied, right?
Hoping for the outcome and an instance of premature convergence. I think we can say that. And I think the next slide actually illustrates.
And so, amongst very many other metrics, right, one of the things that Dimitar and I worked on was just trying to understand the stability of this organization. And what we were seeing is flow debt, right? And what flow debt is, you're basically stealing time from the future, right? Just to give you, I don't want to throw terms that you may not have heard of before, but just think of it as stealing time from the future, right? And what it was doing was growing the queue sizes of teams, and basically people were taking in work, not quite completing it all the way to finish, and then taking on more work. And this concept of irrefutable demand was quite in vogue, right? So to us, it's really, this quote really resonates with us, right? David's quote really resonates with us, right? It is really not considering the unknowns sufficiently, right? The uncertainty sufficiently, right? Being able to learn by setting the right kind of probes is a very, very important thing. As I said to you in the very, very first introduction, it was the unknowns that actually contributed to the success. It turned out to be a lot more relevant to the ultimate success than what we did know and what we could control. Right?
Yeah.
Oh. So this and this are not synced, just so you know. So I keep. And again, another one of David's quotes that sort of resonates. But strategy in the new world, or in the modern world, in the digital world, is going to look different. We're going to have to take into consideration uncertainty, unpredictability in emergent conditions, right? That it is a different world. So static, sort of expert-based, analysis-based type of strategy needs to be morphed. So what did we do? So it's not all bad news. We helped them, right? How did we help them? First thing is we gave them we helped them basically. Well, I don't want to give ourselves too much credit here. What we really were seeing was a pattern of recognition that there is something called the unknown, right? And they were asking the right questions, and we were encouraging them to ask the right questions. How do we know these things, right? Why do we know? Why do we think that's true, right? Basically, helping them understand that whatever you think you know are based on certain assumptions. And that unknown, to discover the unknown, you want to put yourself in the best possible position to discover the unknown, right? And that's not just this ethereal something. It is something that's discoverable many times. And what you want to do is put yourself in the best position. And so the concepts that we gave them, or we helped them understand, part of it was Kinevin, right? Just giving them the vocabulary of Kinevin was a huge step in the right direction, right? Just helping them understand, oh, this is a complex domain. There may be unknown unknowns, right? And then the other thing that we help them implement is a simple implementation of Hoshin Kanri. For those of you who don't know Hoshin Kanri, it's the idea of playing catchball, where the strategy and the tactics of one level of the organization is connected to another level of the organization, and there's sort of a catchball thing that goes on between them. So a visualization of this is something using an X matrix. We basically visualize this thing, right? So these two tools combined with a simple strategy feedback loop became very instrumental for them to prepare for that uncertainty, and to prepare for them to create and identify probes that would help them identify what is it that they need to know.
So it's probably pertinent to also mention that this is all building up to a point where actually a formal meeting was held.
Yes. So in December 2015, the CEO and the middle management, the people who were involved, they basically had this very large meeting where these tools and more importantly, this idea of connecting the vision to the strategy to the tactics was for the first time realized. So it reduced a lot of the consternation in the company. Up until that point, they were seeing a lot of dysfunctions, right? There's lots of gaps, as I described earlier. This was starting to change with the introduction of just respecting the unknown, right? And giving them the tools that help them cross a chasm, if you will, right? And so the strategy feedback loop was basically a combination of people from different sectors, right? There were people from audit, people from legal, people from the financial office, people from the customer service representatives, right? Which was a very, very important piece. People who had no name recognition before, right? There were different people involved in that strategy feedback loop. And out of all the training sessions we did, by that time we had already undertaken. But I mentioned to you there were 120 teams, right? So we did lots and lots of training sessions for these teams. But probably the most important training session of them all was this one 4-hour segment where middle management and executive leadership just went through a simple training of Kinevin and Catchball, or the X matrix. Right?
I think, and even the realizations were crystallizing in that meeting. I think the CEO was there at that meeting as well,
yep.
and made
Yeah, and
specific notes about that.
Yep. I'll tell you, if you stop by the booth, I'll tell you a funny story that came out of that later on. So things that came out, we started to realize was the emphasis on product development of sprint planning meetings and team sizes and how we prioritize and how we do retrospectives and reviews, and the operations even from a Kanban team standpoint, they sort of moved away from those discussions to more value stream centric discussions, right? And once they started to visualize these, they started to see that it's not very linear at all, right? It's very much like a network. And that was a very important realization for them.
Yeah, so we can talk about that in the context of Kanban systems as well. So we'll talk through an example, and this is not the main point of the discussion here, is because the point is about the unknowns, but we can talk about how it was a network and how we could visualize that through the operation of a Kanban system, where we could have, this is part of infrastructure and operations, where a big body of work had to be done, and it would flow through a top-level board. They called it the intake board. It would go through steps of being validated, scored by prioritisation, way to shortest job first, ready for teams to pull that work. So, yeah, of course, we the well-known concept of a system of systems. It's we were visualising the ecosystem, as David said this morning. So we'll move on a little bit more. This is how the board looked, and we won't walk through all that, but it's a process of various policies that would help validate the work and allow teams to pull.
So what it was really doing was, amongst the unknowns, right, there was two large parts to it. One was the work itself, right, in terms of what it is that we don't know about what the teams are actually working on. That was one unknown, so in terms of the work that was being accomplished. But the second level, which was the more important level, was how they worked, right? So both levels were very important in discovering, from an internal standpoint, the dysfunctions, right? There's internal, and then there's sort of the market level, business point of view, things that they were unknown. So from a product standpoint, what they didn't know about customer behavior, right? This is the internal discovery.
Right. So just to give you an example of the network as well, should we talk about that one or just move on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll move back a slide then. Just to illustrate the network, Team A is doing some work, needs some work done, doesn't have all the skills required. All right. So we ask for service to be provided by someone else. We don't know who yet, but it will go through the common intake, go through the same process, ready for another team to pull. All right, and that could include that sequencing process as well, scheduling and sequencing. So we had a visualization of the true network of, it was never continuous, the same sort of connections. It was different nodes lighting up at different times. And of course, there was measurement included as well. Oops. So all the while, various levels of measurement at the program and service owner level and the team level, highlighting these unknowns that Ajay talked about or mentioned. All the while also continually improving to deal with that flow debt problem. Right, so overburdening and unevenness of flow. So using the Kanban toolkit to have WIP limits in dependency columns that first started out as infinite columns but became WIP limited to shape demand, cause more pull rather than push, deal with irrefutable demand, create service level agreements, allow cost of delay to make the right selections, so on and so forth. But as Ajay has already mentioned, that was nice. They were nice things that occurred, but the real holistic thing that occurred was seeing the system as a whole and revealing systemic impediments. So we'll move on.
Yeah, so another thing that was interesting to see as a pattern was before, when the Agile transformation was kicked off, was there was an important role defined in the Scrum Master being the central figure in helping manage the flow, but it was defined and then rolled out. And people had to apply to that role to then sort of fit into the Scrum Master role. And what we were seeing with this sort of probe, sense and respond, and sort of trying to discover the unknown was, hey, let's just document what people are already doing. And so the flow manager role was then documented out of what people were doing, which was a lot less threatening to the people who were actually doing those roles, right? Which was a much, much more accepting way of, which is a very different mindset, right?
It's kind of an opt-in and as-needed approach. You find that some teams had good flow and did not require that role.
And those who wanted to keep their roles just kept their roles. Yeah. So here's another thing we saw. So one of the things that was rolled out before was these Agile health assessments, right? So lots of vendors out there sell these Agile health assessments, and I don't have anything against any one of them. They might be used perfectly fine in their own context. But what we did see in an emergence of is a change where we use a CMMI-based appraisal type, more based on observable capabilities rather than sort of an expert analysis by a domain expert or a coach or a manager assessing the health of these things. And that actually was much more accepted by the teams who were being assessed, right? So what it really did for the teams is now they are on the same page to identify opportunities of improvement, right? So which is a different way of thinking about it. So instead of I'm saying I assess you as level 3 in my assessment versus that based on observable capabilities, which was a different thing. And again, this was set in motion, right?
So that's part of the next slide as well. It's like the behavioural change towards more also outcomes which teams liked better rather than sort of process compliance type assessments.
So we were seeing these behavioural changes, which is really what the win was, right? From a process improvement perspective, right? That's what we're really after in a nutshell, right? And what we really enjoyed seeing was the interaction. So how did they discover these unknowns? Not by sitting down and analyzing, but actually interacting with the system, right? We designed probes to discover and put ourselves in the best possible position to understand that. And I'll give you a specific couple of concrete examples relating to Agile contracts, right? And how that sort of became the instrument by which this company saved a ton of money. So one of the examples is Agile audit. Remember I mentioned the strategy feedback loop that these guys constructed. So before Agile audit was part of this whole journey, if you will, it was the Agile audit folks, the internal Agile audit folks would say, this is the documentation process. This is the process that you need to follow. And then you need to document this process and how you're applying it. That changed to let us discover what the process is and document it, which then they were moving closer to this concept of quote-unquote living documentation. And the BDD folks would love that, right? This idea of living documentation where the boards became the artifacts of documentation. The Kanban boards became the artifacts of documentation, which is really nice to see because it removed a fair amount of waste. Another thing, and a shout out to Pat Reed, who helped me with in consulting with us on this. What we saw was the capitalizable events that that they considered capitalizable were before based on some expert or the manager or people reporting to those things. That moved to more a point-based system based on Grenning's article on InfoQ. And then that moved to taking into consideration lead time to touch time correlations, which is, to me, a very good direction to move in. So that was an interesting, and basically that improved the fidelity of what was capitalizable. Yeah, again, saving money.
So yeah, like there was a dissatisfaction around capitalizable events on story points, and story points being something normalized across teams. It's the fidelity is just way off, and it was just starting to progress towards that lead time measurement. And capitalizable events, that means more dollars for you, for the company. So.
Yeah. And then this was one of the very important wins for the company. So remember I mentioned earlier on they chose a vendor to help with their re-platforming and digital transformation and sort of bringing them into building these new product lines. That vendor, the analysis that took place was the vendor was part of that whole process. And what they were going to do basically a pilot, which they in our viewpoint, they were just looking for evidence for the confirmation, right? And that always is so. The decision was already sort of made in a nutshell, right? So what they sort of basically instituted was an Agile contract in the place of, and I'll explain how the contract was constructed. Instead of this long-term contract, what they basically suggested was, hey, listen, we need to build trust here, right? And we need to build trust incrementally. And the way we build trust is through the validation of what is going to actually occur in realized code, in working code. And that sort of mechanism was very key. And what we helped them with is basically what they call a metrics package, which basically kind of validated their findings from on a periodic basis. That really came through to fruition to say the insurance domain that they had expertise in versus what they were trying to achieve were far apart. The capabilities of that particular platform and here were far apart. The capabilities of this vendor and this working relationship were far apart. The risks that they were trying to reduce and what they were actually reducing were far apart. So these realizations came through. So what happened is basically a sharpening of this, a skinifying of that program to a much smaller program that specifically reduced very tangible risks in their context. And that, by their own admission, by a conservative estimate, saved them 300M, which we don't hear every day in my career. So it was a significant win for us. So some of the bigger revelations and wins.
Just want to move on the clicker. Yeah.
These are some of the realizations for us in the last couple of years. And I've mentioned a lot of those things, but one of the main things I would like to point out here is that there was a recognition of a tendency that we have a tendency of looking for evidence to prove our beliefs, right? Forgive me for wording it improperly there, but the idea is that we have a tendency to find evidence to prove what we think we know.
It's confirmation bias.
It's confirmation bias. That was like the big win in that context. So Three key takeaways. Each system is varying complexity, has varying complexity. And trying to have the same approach of analysis, or trying to discover even the complex domain and the complicated domain, or the domain of unknowns and the domain of known unknowns, it's more of a spectrum, right? So the art of identifying what experiments you want to conduct, what probes you want to conduct, it's something that you can learn, and something that it's not that difficult. It's just these tools, some of these tools, again, the tools that I mentioned, Kinevin or Xmatrix, those are not the answers, right? You can misuse those tools as well, just as you can misuse the 7S or the Porter model or the BCG box or any of these other tools, the strategy tools that I mentioned earlier. Even those can be misused, right? So it is really respecting the unknown, knowing and putting yourself in a position where you can discover those things by identifying what is it that you're trying to solve for, and how can you discover what you need to solve that problem with. That's the challenge, right?
I think I want to add to that is there's value in the unknowns, and bringing those unknowns out earlier is where you can leverage a lot of capability. Right?
Yeah.
So
and
really,
the second point is also a key one. Many times these quote-unquote agile transformations and agile offices, and take your favorite name pick, they can actually become impediments in it. They may help, because it's sort of, you almost come with the idea that we know what we're doing, we have the solutions, and I'll tell you, we made tons of mistakes, and what we actually gained benefit from was mostly from what we did not know, right? So we just were in positions where we kept on learning, and we helped them put themselves in positions where they kept on learning and adapting as they went, right? And in our viewpoint, the tools that I mentioned really gave us the benefit, because the Kanban systems that the coaches implemented, the multiple connected Kanban systems, really helped us identify what kind of dysfunctions, what kind of instability, what kind of demand and capability imbalances we were seeing, which gave us a lot of information, what kind of gaps we were seeing in the kind of risks we were trying to reduce and what we were actually reducing. So in a nutshell, those were the wins for us. Any questions?